Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website and those who are joining us on C-SPAN TV. We would ask those in-house to make that courtesy check that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off. And for those watching online, you're welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And we, of course, will post today's program on our Heritage homepage following the presentation for everyone's future reference. Leading our program and hosting on behalf of Heritage is Jordan Hess. Mr. Hess is Director of our Coalition Relations Department. He previously served on the staff of Senator Mike Lee, managed the Senator's 2016 campaign, and worked for the Senate Steering Committee. Before coming to Washington, he also served as a field director for the Utah Republican Party and worked for State Senator Margaret Dayton, who at the time was Rules Committee Chairman for the Utah Senate. He earned his bachelor's degree in political science from Brigham Young University and his master's degree in legislative affairs from the George Washington University. Please join me in welcoming Jordan Hess. Jordan.
Thank you, John. My name is Jordan Hess, Director of Coalition Relations here at the Heritage Foundation, and I would like to welcome you to this panel discussion being hosted by the Heritage Foundation and co-hosted by our friends at Discovery Institute. Discovery Institute promotes thoughtful analysis and effective action on local, regional, national, and international issues. The Institute is home to an interdisciplinary community of scholars and policy advocates dedicated to the reinvigoration of traditional Western principles and institutions and the worldview from which they issued. Discovery Institute has a special concern for the role that science and technology play in our culture and how they can advance free markets, illuminate public policy, and support the theistic foundations of the West. The Institute was founded in 1991 and is headquartered in Seattle, Washington, with scholars and fellows located all over the country and even internationally. So thank you, Discovery Institute. I would now like to introduce our moderator and panelist, Jay Richards, and then I'll let him introduce the rest of the panel and kick off the discussion. Jay Richards is an assistant research professor in the School of Business and Economics at the Catholic University of America. He's executive editor of The Stream and a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute, where he works with the Center on Wealth, Poverty, and Morality. He is author of many books, including New York Times bestsellers Infiltrated and Indivisible, as well as Money, Greed, and God. He's an executive producer of many documentaries as well and has articles published in many large publications. He has a PhD with honors in philosophy and theology from Princeton Theological Seminary. He also has a Master's of Divinity, a Master's of Theology, and a BA with majors in political science and religion. So Jay, I'll now turn it over to you and welcome our panelists.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for joining us. I hope going to be a very interesting and interdisciplinary panel. It's not primarily a panel about science itself or the evidence of science, but the social and the cultural implications and role of science. And we're going to talk a little bit about the March for Science, and that was the impetus for forming this panel, is the March for Science, which will be held not just here in Washington, D.C., but around the country, and in fact around the world on Earth Day, which is this Saturday. And many of us, including myself, would contend that the March for Science, at least according to its title, sounds like a laudable goal. But if you look at the actual motives and initial statements that came from the original organizers for the March for Science, many think that it seems to be something slightly different, either a march for increased federal funding for big science, or maybe even particular political or partisan ideologies. And so that's the sort of thing that we want to talk about. So we're not going to talk about the march itself, but we want to talk about the social and cultural role that science plays in our society. So let me just briefly introduce the other three panelists, and then I will hand it over to them. We'll just each give a brief opening statement, and we'd like to spend most of our time actually interacting with those of you that are here. Let me introduce people in reverse order. First here to my left is Dr. Steve Meyer, who received his PhD in the philosophy of science from the University of Cambridge. He's also the co-founder and director of Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture, and he's the author of two prominent books on intelligent design, 2009's Signature in the Cell and 2013 New York Times bestseller, Darwin's Doubt. Wesley J. Smith, next to him, is a lawyer, a bioethicist, and an award-winning author. He co-chairs Discovery Institute's Center on Human Exceptionalism, where he is also a senior fellow. He's a consultant to the Patients' Rights Council and a special consultant for the Center for Bioethics and Culture, and he writes the Human Exceptionalism blog at National Review Online. Finally, Marlo Lewis is a senior fellow in energy and environmental policy at the Competitive Enterprise Institute here in Washington, D.C. His current research interests chiefly include the science, economics, law, and politics of global warming policy. He's widely published, and in fact, I think one of the keenest and most acute commentators on issues having to do with energy and climate in the country. He holds a PhD in government from Harvard University and a BA in political science from Claremont McKenna College. So without further ado, we will go starting with Marlo and then move our way right. Thank you. Marlo, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Jay, for that kind introduction. And when you said a short opening statement, can you please just clarify again how many minutes we're talking about?
Let's shoot for 12 minutes.
Oh, okay, great. All right. Well, I'm not a scientist, but I try to follow the science of climate change to the extent of my abilities. My background is in, or my graduate study, you might say, was in political philosophy and in particular Platonic political philosophy. And so I'm going to start with a snippet from a Platonic dialogue, one of my favorites, called the Theaetetus, the question of which is what is knowledge. Most of these dialogues pose a what is type question. And this is the only dialogue in which Socrates actually interacts with what you might call scientists. Before Socrates, in fact, all philosophers studied natural science to the extent that that was possible in those ancient times. They tried to understand weather phenomena, they tried to understand astronomical phenomena, they tried to understand the human body, other animals and plants and how they work. They were completely disinterested in what Plato would have called the human things, politics. And so Socrates is talking to one of these characters. His name is Theodorus, who was a famous mathematician, or actually the teacher of a famous mathematician, that being Theaetetus, after which the dialogue is titled, who contributed most of the work that became the chapter on irrational numbers in Euclid's Elements. So Socrates was talking to some pretty heavy hitters in those days. And so Socrates says, philosophers, which again is in those days was equivalent to scientists, don't know the way to the marketplace or where's a court, council house, or anything else that's a common assembly in the city. And laws and decrees they neither see nor hear. And the serious business of clubs for gaining office and meetings, it doesn't even occur to them in their dreams. And the philosopher or scientist doesn't even know that he does not know all these things. You remember Socrates' famous definition of his knowledge, which was that he knew nothing, but other people didn't know that they didn't know anything, right? And so Theodorus' reaction is, what do you mean by that, Socrates? And so Theodorus is this pure mathematician, and he is so disinterested in anything non-mathematical that he doesn't even recognize himself in this caricature that Socrates has drawn about people like him. And so why am I bringing this up? Well, today scientists appear to be very different from Theodorus. You know, they know very well their way into the law courts. They relish political intrigue. Think of the ClimateGate scandal. They march. They carry placards. Think of this event that's coming up on Saturday. They demand conformity to consensus position statements, you know, which is a kind of a political litmus test of whether you can belong to our club or not. And they often behave like shrill partisans. So have they really changed from Plato's time? Well, no, because what they still lack is self-awareness, which is the age-old occupational hazard of the egghead, okay? This remains a common failing of the tribe. Very few of them have thought critically about the natures of science and politics and how those things differ. And as a consequence, many have a naive belief that activism and science can easily coexist not only in the same organization or institution, but in the same psyche. They have no sense of the temptations that politics presents that to anyone who engages in it that can corrupt the judgment, including scientific judgment. And so all too often, they have no clue that when they behave like partisan hacks in the name of science, they politicize science and undermine public trust in science. And I think that explains to a great extent what we're seeing today in the whole climate science debate and why these people are now complaining that the public doesn't trust them. Well, when you use your expertise as a license to regulate others and tax others and say, listen, trust us, we're the experts, you've got to do what we say because we're the experts, ordinary people are going to get very skeptical, not only about your expertise, but about your motives, your agendas, and they can't understand why this is happening. And so every time they encounter resistance, they just double down and invoke their consensus as the debate-stopping be-all and end-all that should settle the issue so that we can all just get on implementing their program, their plan. Now, I wanted to bring up an example of this that occurred just 2 weeks ago. It was at a House Science Committee hearing. The hearing was on climate science and the scientific method. And at that hearing, one of my favorite climate scientists, a gentleman named John Christie, who is one of the people that runs the satellite program for NASA out of the University of Alabama in Huntsville. And Christie presented evidence that, number one, the climate models that form the basis of the alleged consensus, climate science consensus, are tuned too hot. That is to say, they are overly sensitive. They overestimate the effects of carbon dioxide emissions on global temperatures. He actually had this wonderful slide which shows 3 different observational data sets, one from weather balloons, one from satellites, and one from what are called reanalyses, because all of this raw data has to be managed in some way, cleaned up before it can be interpreted. The point, though, is that he was looking at the results of 10 independent empirical data sets and comparing those to climate model projections over the last 37 years. Okay, so almost 40 years. And what you see is an increasing divergence, whereas the models are projecting more and more warming and the observations are showing much less, and the divergence expands over time. Now, you'd think that that might give some people pause, the scientists, and that it would also, in a sense, be a scientific method test of the validity of the models. But it's only skeptics like Christie who point this out. The other people, it's like, oh, this is really no problem. Just give us another 10 years or another 20 years, and you'll see that the observations will catch up to the models. The other thing that Christie did was he looked at the gap between the observations and the model projections in a critical component of the atmosphere. He calls it the bulk tropical atmosphere, which is technically the troposphere, the mid-troposphere from about the surface up to about 50,000 feet, and it's from 20 degrees south of the equator to 20 degrees north of the equator. That's where a huge amount of the sun's energy enters the Earth's climate system and drives critical temperature and moisture processes throughout the Earth, okay, because it's through the uneven heating of the Earth that you have weather events, and that combined with the Earth's rotation is what creates all these wind patterns, which then affect the ocean. So, and it also, a lot of this heat energy goes directly into the ocean. But anyway, it's a critical part of the atmosphere. And the IPCC consensus, basically, the sort of citadel, the fortress of it that everybody invokes and claims 97% of all climate science agree on, is the proposition that more than half of the warming of the globe since 1950 is anthropogenic, comes from human activity, greenhouse gases, all right? And the IPCC, I actually don't think that's really that important an issue. A lot of people a lot of people pretend that if you accept that, then you accept the whole agenda of the Clean Power Plan and, the Paris Agreement and all these other policies, which are all cost for no benefit and potentially a humanitarian disaster, because we really don't know how to run the global economy yet without fossil fuels. But they pretend that the whole issue is wrapped up in this consensus statement on what they call attribution. Okay, there's a certain amount of warming. How much of it is attributable to human causes versus natural variability? And what Christie shows there, he takes a chart from the IPCC report, the latest report itself. The IPCC is the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. All right, so this is the consensus the authority on consensus climatology. And if you look at the chart in the IPCC report, you can't really understand what's going on. It's so small and everything is compressed together. And the IPCC also conveniently buried it without comment in supplementary material. Well, Christie took it, enlarged it, and clarified it. And what he finds is that in this critical weather zone, the tropical weather formation zone, the tropical troposphere, that the models match the observations. And there's a range for both. There's a range of model projections and a range of observations, because not all of the observational systems completely agree, okay? But that the range of observations and the range of model projections only coincide when the models are not run with greenhouse gas emissions, only when the models are run with natural variability alone. And the whole claim that the IPCC now has made for almost 20 years is that they know that more than half the warming is due to human activity, because the models and the observations only agree when the models are run with both known natural variability and extra greenhouse gas emissions. Christie shows, based on their own data, that it's precisely the reverse. Mm-hmm. Now, does that mean that he has disproven their claim that more than half the warming is anthropogenic? No, but it means that they can't claim to know it. They claim to know it with what they call, they say that it is extremely likely, which means that they say that there is a greater than 95% chance that they're right about this. And how they reconcile that with their own data becomes really problematic. In science, you actually never prove anything, but what you do is you can invalidate a hypothesis on the basis of data. It doesn't mean that some future test won't show that the hypothesis actually was correct. But until you actually have data that supports the hypothesis, you're not entitled to claim that it's true or more likely true, all right? And what Christie has shown is quite the reverse. Okay, so what happened? Then a week later, a fellow named Keith Sider, executive director of the American Meteorological Society, wrote to House Science Committee Chairman Lamar Smith and said, "You are retailing pseudoscientific denialism. Everybody knows that more than half the warming in the last 50 years is anthropogenic." In fact, I just want to read his specific word here. He said, "Indeed, to suggest that humans are not responsible for most of the warming we've experienced over the past 50 years indicates a disregard for the scientific process and a vast amount of testable evidence that has been amassed on this subject. Hypotheses have been developed and tested through scientific experiments." Well, that's exactly what Christie did in his testimony. He said, here's the hypothesis, here's the data, let's test it. Oops, the hypothesis doesn't hold up when tested against the data. Now, in this long diatribe of a letter, did Keith Sider ever once actually specifically mention a study or a testable experiment that supports the consensus position? No. What he did once again was appeal to make an argument from authority, trust us, we're the experts. Did he once actually engage Christie's argument? No, he didn't even acknowledge it, but he was alluding to it in the entire letter. That was his reason for writing the letter, was to claim that Christie had somehow trashed the scientific method, whereas in fact Christie was practicing it, and he was just making an appeal to authority, which is not a scientific argument at all. And so, could he not see what he was doing? Apparently not. It's just like Theodorus, that ancient scientist. This guy lacks self-awareness, a sense of irony, and sometimes I think you have to check your sense of self-awareness and sense of irony at the door in order to enter the temple of consensus climatology. So that will be, I think, my introductory statement for today. Thank you.
Thanks, Marlo. Wesley?
Thank you. 12 minutes?
12 minutes.
I'm a lawyer.
I know two of you are lawyers.
Can't clear your throat in
That's
12
right.
minutes.
It takes me that long to clear my throat. Exactly. You just stole my jokes. I find this whole March for Science rather odd. First, I don't know of anybody who's anti-science, maybe Ted Kaczynski. But other than that, science is a method. It is a very powerful method by which human beings gain knowledge of the world and find applications to hopefully improve the human condition. It can, of course, go the other way. But science is a method. It's an amoral method. It's a very powerful method. And yet we are told by certain members of the media within the science intelligentsia that there are those among us who are anti-science, so much so that we need a march, which seems to me to be an obvious attempt to harness the energy of the March for Women that occurred right after the inauguration, only without the funny pink hats. The people who I think are actually harming science, and I think harming people who do the bench science, because bench scientists aren't part of this. Bench scientists are sitting in their work, their labs, their field work, and they're trying to gain the information in an apolitical way. But the people who are pushing the March for Science, and the media in particular, their actions are the ones I think that if anyone's hurting science, it's them. And there are four ways that I can think of, and I only have, since I've been not given my usual hour and a half, there are four ways I think this is happening, but I'll only discuss two of them. The first one is that often science is conflated with ethics or morality. So if somebody takes a different ethical position than the, quote, science advocate, then the person with the different ethical position is labeled anti-science. Second, anti-science is used as an epithet to shut down legitimate debate. Third, and this was mentioned in the previous discussion, the consensus is now used to stifle exploration of legitimate heterodox hypotheses. And I think Steve knows about that really, really well. And the fourth is there are some statements being made that are truly, if the term can be used, anti-science, that the mainstream or the liberal intelligentsia or the science intelligentsia often ignore. And I will get into that. So let me talk a little bit about the conflation of science with ethics and morality. I saw this most acutely and first when I was involved in the embryonic stem cell debate during the George Bush years. And I was making an ethical claim to support George W. Bush's funding policy for embryonic stem cell research. And often you would hear things like, well, Bush has banned embryonic stem cell research. He hadn't. In fact, the Bush administration spent tens of millions of dollars with NIH funding of human embryonic stem cell research, which often was not reported. But I would be in front of legislatures, and I would hear scientists, PhD scientists who did work, actually lie to legislators or to the media and say things that were patently false. And one of them was that an embryo is not really human life. I had done my research with embryology textbooks, which is science. And embryology textbook after embryology textbook told me that a human embryo is a nascent human being, that is a developing human being, and that means it is human life. Now, science can tell us what that embryo is. It cannot tell us whether it is right or wrong to use that embryo instrumentally in research. That isn't in the realm of science. Science can only tell us what the embryo is biologically. It cannot tell us whether it is wrong to destroy that embryo for stem cells. That is a different realm of discussion. But I would hear that because I was making an ethical claim with which many who wanted to do this research disagreed, that I was somehow against science itself. And yet, once in a while, some clarity goes through the clouds of obfuscation. There's a book by Lee M. Silver. Lee M. Silver is a biology professor at Princeton, and he wrote a book that's very helpful to my positions. He didn't mean it that way, but it is, called Remaking Eden. And in the book Remaking Eden, which is actually an early transhumanist manifesto about how we were all going to someday become, he wouldn't call them spirit beings because he's a materialist, but immaterial beings that will make the current human beings look the equivalent of earthworms. That's we'll be off in the sky somewhere understanding everything there is to exist in the material world. But during that book, he talks about the fact, from his perspective, that the term embryo has been redefined for a political purpose. And let me quote Lee M. Silver. I'll let you in on a secret. The term pre-embryo, which is often used for a pre-implantation embryo, has been embraced wholeheartedly for reasons that are political and not scientific. The new term is used to provide the illusion that there is something profoundly different between what we non-medical biologists still call a 6-day-old embryo, the blastocyst, and what we and everyone else call a 16-day-old embryo, an embryo that has begun to develop differentiated tissues. Now, I have heard scientists say, that's not an embryo, it's a blastocyst. Before legislative committees trying to claim that a blastocyst wasn't an embryo. And as Silver just pointed out, a blastocyst is an embryo, and that is how it is the term used for a particular stage of embryonic development. The term pre-embryo is useful in the political arena where decisions are made about whether to allow early embryo, now called pre-embryo experimentation, as well as in the confines of a doctor's office where it can be used to allay moral concerns that might be expressed by IVF patients. Don't worry, a doctor might say, it's only pre-embryos that we're manipulating and freezing. They won't turn into real human embryos until we put them back in your body. And that's close quote. Now that to me is anti-science. When you take a basic term, a basic biological term, embryo or blastocyst, and redefine it for a political purpose, causing division within the society, you have actually harmed the scientific enterprise because you are going to take the idea of bench scientists and the scientific science as a method, and you are going to make it so political that some people are going to turn away from science itself as a positive good. And that was just false. In another example, I was called anti-science because I opposed 3-parent human embryos. Well, I wasn't making a science claim, I was making an ethical claim. There's no way that can be called anti-science. In fact, I am very pro-science, as is everyone on this dais. Here's another example. At the presentation of the American Association for the Advancement of Science a few years ago, that with all due respect and great fanfare, there was a presentation for cetacean rights, that is, rights for whales and dolphins. Now, granting rights to whales and dolphins is not a question of science. That's a question of morality, that's a question of philosophy, that's a question of politics, and this is all part of the animal rights movement, which we should distinguish from animal welfare. Those are not the same thing at all. And so some of the presenters concluded that every cetacean, that is a whale or a dolphin, has a right to life. Now, I'll wager that many of those who made that presentation don't think that humans have a right to life, because it's not science, it's politics. Science can't tell us whether humans have a right to life. Some of the others, all cetaceans have the right to freedom of movement and residence within their natural environment. This is actually setting forth human duties that are being posited towards whales and dolphins. Dolphins can't have rights. They can't even understand the concept. We can define our duties towards them. We can also define them so extremely, as we often see in these debates, that we're going to do great sacrifice to human well-being. But this was at a science symposium, a convention, to promote science. That's not science. That's not science. I will move past the anti-science epithet, which I mentioned briefly, and the use of the consensus to stifle heterodox research and hypotheses, and get into some of the things that are being stated out in the media and by science advocates who claim to be science advocates that are just really bizarre, and they don't even seem to warrant comment from the supposed defenders of science. For example, in the New York Times, which frequently castigates people who challenge the consensus on global warming or challenge the consensus on neo-Darwinism as being anti-science, they published, with all due respect, a professor saying that peas are persons. Yes, peas, you know what we eat, peas. And here's what he said: the renewal, when it comes to a plant, it turns out to be not only a what, but also a who. An agent in its milieu with its own intrinsic value or version of the good. A pea is not sentient. A pea doesn't think. What he was talking about or writing about was that the peas, apparently through some chemical action, can alert other pea plants that there might be a drought, for example. But it isn't sentient. It isn't a who. That is not an intentional action. It is just what happens because of how the pea exists in today's world. But in the New York Times, and a book was written about it. And he basically, this fellow is Michael Martyr, who's a PhD, of course, sorry guys. He basically said we shouldn't eat annuals, but only perennials, because we can justify eating perennials because that's like a gift from us. But the pea doesn't know if we eat the pea. The tomato doesn't know if we eat the tomato. That was published in the New York Times. And here's a publishing from a woman who is the New York Times, or at least was when she wrote this, science writer named Natalie Angier. She said that plants are the most ethical life form, as if plants have ethics. Quote, just because we humans can't hear them doesn't mean plants don't howl. Some of the compounds that plants generate in response to insect mastication, their feedback, you might say, are volatile chemicals that serve as cries for help. Such airborne alarm cells have been shown to attract both large predatory insects like dragonflies, which delight in caterpillar meat, and tiny parasitic insects which can infect a caterpillar and destroy it from within. The plant is not aware that it is releasing those chemicals. Something else, I think Steve would say, something that was very intelligent, made that occur. She goes on, it's a small daily tragedy that we animals must kill to stay alive. Plants are the ethical autotrophs here, the ones that wrest their meals from the sun. Don't expect them to boast. They're too busy fighting to survive. They can't boast. They don't know. And what about those Venus flytraps? They digest those flies alive. I mean, this is just crazy. And to me, if anyone should be complaining about anti-science advocates for science, it should be a science writer in the New York Times writing that kind of claptrap. This has also led to some public policy issues. Switzerland's constitution has declared the intrinsic dignity of individual plants. Now, that's not a scientific statement, that's an ideological statement. So the government assigned this big committee, Science and Bioethics Committee, to decide why it is that science should, and the law of Switzerland should accord individual plants dignity. And it reminded me of a joke. When I've been in debates with neo-Darwinists and others who have said, you know, there really is no distinction between the species, since we all evolved out of the same primordial ooze, we should do away with species distinctions. And I'll say, well, let's really get reductionist. Carrots are made from carbon molecules, and so are we, so there's no distinction between us and carrots. That's been my joke. Why do plants have dignity according to this report, which is called The Dignity of Living Beings with Regard to Plants? I will quote you. This opinion was justified either by arguing that plants strive after something. Plants are not striving. Striving is a conscious decision, which should not be blocked without good reason, or that recent findings in natural science, such as the many commonalities between plants, animals, and humans at molecular and cellular levels, remove the reasons for excluding plants in principle from the moral community. My joke is now the public policy of Switzerland. That, to me, is anti-science. And by the way, this kind of thing has real impact. The Wall Street Journal had an article that was very disturbing. A fellow was doing, in Switzerland, research on wheat, and he wanted to make it so that the wheat, bless you, so that the wheat would be less subject to fungus. And he was denied the funding until he was able to go and say, but this would be good for the wheat. And so then he got the funding, and then because of this, the true anti-science, the anti-GMO types, he was developing this wheat that would resist fungus, that could help ease so much starvation. And the true anti-science types in the anti-GMO world went in and they tore up all the experimental wheat. And you didn't see headlines in the New York Times about anti-science. You didn't see the marchers in the streets saying, protect the GMO research. In fact, from my understanding of that march, some of the sponsors are anti-GMO organizations. Now, one can be anti-GMO, but that's not science. That's policy, that's ethics, that's morality. And it's also interesting that many of the people who are against GMO are pro-human cloning. So go figure. There's also something coming down the pike now, and it's becoming very alarming to me, called nature rights. That is the nature rights movement to grant rights, human-type rights to nature. I don't know if you saw in the last couple of weeks, but 2 rivers have been declared, actually 3 rivers have been declared to be persons and given human-type rights, 1 in New Zealand and 2 in India, one of them being the Ganges River. And 2 glaciers have also been declared to be persons. With basically equal rights to humans. And then committees were assigned to decide what should be done with the river. And if the river is deemed to be harmed, the river is going to be able to bring a lawsuit in the same way a human being might if the human being was rear-ended or something. Now, does this mean that the Ganges has the right to flow unimpeded to the sea? And if the Ganges, why not the Colorado? If the Colorado River is a person entitled to rights, do we have to tear down Hoover Dam? And consider what this means in terms of human exceptionalism, the unique value of human beings as well as our duties. If nature has rights, that means pond scum, viruses, mosquitoes, then everything has rights. And if everything has rights, the very concept of rights loses its potency. It'll be like currency in the Weimar Republic. It'll become meaningless. And I see Jay telling me to shut up. So I will cool it for now, but it seems to me that the real problem here in terms of science becoming a divisive aspect of our culture isn't science. It's certainly not the bench scientists. It's those who are politicizing science to win political debates, to win cultural debates, and to win moral debates. Thank you.
Thanks, Wesley. Steve?
Yeah, it's the ideology, stupid. In fact, there are 2 definitions of science, 2 ways to think about this. There's the science as a method of acquiring data and evidence about the natural world and evaluating that evidence, interpreting that evidence. That's on the one hand. And on the other hand, there's science as applied materialistic philosophy or applied naturalism, a worldview, which says that matter and energy are all that exists and that any ethical value is derived from nature itself. I did my PhD work on a method of scientific reasoning called the method of multiple competing hypotheses. And one of the things that happens when people appeal to consensus as a way of establishing what is or is not science is that those people who make such appeals actually undercut this very method of scientific evaluation. This is the first definition of science, a method of reasoning or evaluating data. There's a wonderful Italian philosopher of science named Marcello Pera, who argues in his book, The Discourses of Science, that science advances as scientists argue about how to interpret the evidence, the relevant evidence in a given field. If you have people subverting that process of argumentation by appeals to consensus, which end up using stigmatizing rhetoric like deniers. I love that one. Who really is a science denier? Only people who disagree with us. Then the people who make such appeals are actually undercutting the method of science, or one of the key methods of science, which involves this comparative hypothesis testing, which requires, as a part of that method, the ability to argue freely about how to interpret evidence. And we have an awful lot of that going on in a number of these different hot-button scientific issues that are at the forefront of the March for Science. And when that happens, what invariably ensues when you have these appeals to consensus or settled science or stigmatizing anyone who disagrees as a science denier, what happens then is you enshrine a particular scientific point of view, or maybe an ethical extension of that point of view, as a kind of ideology. And one of the ideological factions in this March for Science that's coming up is a group of people that I like to call Darwin's public defenders. And this is my little piece in this panel and discussion. The public defenders are people like Bill Nye, the science guy, Richard Dawkins, Lawrence Krauss, formerly Eugenie Scott, who was the head of the National Center for Science Education. And these folks are promoting Darwinian evolution not only as settled science, but in the case of Dawkins and Krauss especially, as the basis for a fully materialistic ideology, which they in fact call the new atheism. They argue that science properly understood supports an atheistic worldview. And the science they have in mind is the theory of Darwinian evolution. And Dawkins' argument is very interesting on this. He says that prior to Darwin, the strongest argument for God's existence was the evidence of design in nature. But since the advent of the Darwinian theory, we now know that there isn't really design in nature, only the appearance of design. Why is the appearance of design that we see in biological systems, whether it's the complex structure of the eye or the different wiring and chambers of the heart, or the coiled nautilus, or the digital code in DNA, why are these appearances of design not really design? Well, according to both classical Darwinism and modern neo-Darwinism, these appearances are merely illusions because there's an unguided, undirected mechanism, namely natural selection acting on random variations and mutations, that can produce that appearance of design without being guided or directed in any way. So the foundation of the new atheism is neo-Darwinism. The foundation of neo-Darwinism is the claim that natural selection and random mutation have unlimited creative power, including the power to produce intricate, integrated systems that give the appearance of having been designed, but were not in fact designed because they were produced by this undirected process. Now, I wrote a book a couple years ago called Darwin's Doubt. And part of the title was to contrast Darwin's own self-reflective and modest rhetorical modesty with the rhetorical excess of his current public defenders. But another part of the purpose of the book was to highlight the huge disparity that presently exists between the presentation of the status of Darwinian theory, of contemporary Darwinian theory, in the media, in policy statements by groups like the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, in the statements that are made by people like Bill Nye, the science guy who's written a book recently called Undeniable, which is what he thinks the evidence for neo-Darwinism is, and Richard Dawkins, who says that if you doubt neo-Darwinism, you're either stupid, ignorant, or insane, or then he says, or possibly wicked, but he'd prefer not to consider that. I always thought that was rather sporting of him not to consider that. But you see this huge rhetorical excess in support of an alleged consensus in support further of neo-Darwinian theory. And yet, when you get into the technical literature in biology, you find that leading biologists, including leading evolutionary biologists, now openly doubt the creative power of the central mechanism of neo-Darwinian theory, which is the mechanism of natural selection acting on random mutations. This came home to me very poignantly several years ago. I was testifying before the Texas State Board of Education. They had an innocuous policy proposal that they were putting forward in which they were suggesting that teachers be allowed to inform students about the strengths and weaknesses of competing scientific hypotheses. The Darwin-only science education lobby turned out in force to say the Texas State Board and could not apply that to their theory, to the theory of neo-Darwinian evolution, because in the words of Eugenie Scott, evolution, quote, has no weaknesses. Now, I was there to testify, and part of my testimony put into evidence 100 peer-reviewed scientific papers that were raising questions about the central mechanism of neo-Darwinism. Again, natural selection acting on random mutations. Many scientists now say that that mechanism explains the survival, but not the arrival of the fittest. It explains the small-scale variations, but it does not explain the major morphological innovations, the major innovations in form that we see arising episodically in the history of life as documented by the fossil record. Now, in November, I attended, along with a number of other scientists in our larger network, the meeting of the Royal Society of London. It's the oldest and most august scientific body in the world. They, for the first time, have put on the table in their November meeting the status of neo-Darwinism as a point of scientific discussion. Many of the scientists there were part of a group that has been called the Altenberg 16 or the Third Way, or proponents of an extended synthesis. These are scientists who have utterly now rejected neo-Darwinism as an adequate theory of evolution and are looking for new evolutionary mechanisms to either supplement or replace the neo-Darwinian mechanism of natural selection and random mutation, because they also believe that that mechanism lacks the creative power to generate fundamental innovation in the history of life. One of the first speakers at this conference, Gerd Müller, leading Austrian evolutionary biologist, started by outlining the explanatory deficits of this textbook orthodoxy, the theory that we all learn in high school and biology, high school and college biology textbooks. And the deficits that he outlined were as follows. Its inability to explain biological or phenotypic complexity, the inability to explain morphological novelty, the problem of the abrupt appearance of major innovations in the history of life. These are major problems with the theory that are well documented in the peer-reviewed literature, that were discussed openly at a major scientific conference this last summer, and yet you will not hear a word of that breathed in the March for Science. There will be many factions in this march who will be advocating for textbook orthodoxy and not acknowledging that these scientific problems even exist. I'd like to just highlight a little bit from my perspective why these problems are so acute and so formidable. The big discovery in modern biology comes in the 1950s with the, how am I doing on time today? Yeah, okay. With the molecular biological revolution. Watson and Crick elucidate the structure of DNA in 1953. 4 years later, Francis Crick puts forward a phenomenally insightful hypothesis called the sequence hypothesis, in which he notes that the DNA molecule with its twisting helix shape encodes along its spine information in a digital or alphabetic form. That the chemical subunits called bases that run along the spine of the DNA, literally he proposed function as digital characters or alphabetic characters in a section of meaningful information, or meaningful either text or software. That the DNA is storing information in a digital typographic or alphabetic form, information that, as it turns out, is crucial to the construction of the proteins and protein machines that are necessary for all forms of life to exist. Now, this has raised an incredible set of questions for evolutionary theory. In particular, where did that information come from? Here's the situation. If you want to give your computer a new function, we all know you have to provide code. The same thing turns out to be true in the history of life. Whenever we see a large jump in the complexity of living organisms, innovations occurring in the fossil record, those morphological innovations, innovations in form, would have required informational infusions, inputs of information to produce that new form. Just as the computer, new function requires new information, in biology the same is true. New form and function requires new information. So there's a huge question of where that information comes from. And this has been the problem that increasingly evolutionary biologists and chemical evolutionary theorists who are concerned about the origin of the first life have had to address. And here's the problem. If you have a basic awareness of computer programming, ask yourself the question. If you have a section of digital code, digital information, and you start randomly changing the bits, the digital characters, are you more likely to degrade that information or generate a new operating system or a computer program? Programmers, when I ask the question rhetorically, always laugh. Inevitably, random changes in a sequence of functional information are going to degrade that information and degrade it to non-functionality long before you would ever get to a new functional program or operating system. It turns out that in all probability, the same is true in living systems. And so the neo-Darwinian mechanism, which relies precisely on random changes called mutations in the arrangement of these digital or chemical characters, is subject to that same problem of informational degradation. The mechanism which is proposed as a means of generating new form actually degrades information rather than generating it, and yet you need new information to generate new form. So that, among many other problems, lies at the heart of this increasing crisis in the orthodox theory. Leading biologists at the Royal Society meeting have been quoted in other contexts as saying neo-Darwinism has no theory of the generative, and that skepticism about neo-Darwinism is now actually passé. So early 90s, one leading biologist said. Now, this message is not getting through to the general public, which is one of the reasons I wrote the book Darwin's Doubt. The problem that Darwin was concerned about was the origin of the major animal groups in an event called the Cambrian explosion. But as I show in my book, that problem is actually only the leading edge of a much deeper problem, which is not just the origin of new forms in the fossil record, it's the origin of the information necessary to build those forms. And so the skepticism about the theory continues to grow in scientific circles, and yet at the same time you have this strange disconnect where the ideological promulgation of the orthodox theory goes on unabated with ever louder denunciations for anyone who raises questions about it in public, as again science deniers or people who are anti-science or pseudoscience. You get all the same epithets in all the different debates. So my concern today is to expose some of the scientific problems with the theory and return to a situation in science where we can have an open evaluation of competing hypotheses without stigmatizing alternative views as against the scientific method. In fact, it's people who do that, who stigmatize alternative perspectives and alternative theories or hypotheses, who are acting in a profoundly anti-scientific way insofar as they are shutting down the very discourse of science which is necessary for the evaluation of scientific hypotheses, which is how science advances. Thank you very much.
Terrific, Steve. Thanks so much. Let me just finish up very briefly with a brief discussion of the rhetorical use of this idea of consensus. All three other panelists have actually used this term. We're all familiar with it. What's the rhetorical function of consensus when applied? Normally we hear this, it has something to do with climate change, but it's used for all sorts of very scientific ideas. So what's the function of that? What's the purpose of invoking consensus? It's almost always, presumably, to imply that the experts who are best suited to be able to make a judgment about a particular idea are in general or overwhelming agreement about that subject. So really the function of invoking consensus is essentially to silence skeptical doubts from non-specialists, and in particular from non-scientists. And this sets up a problem because, of course, there's public funding of science. Half of what the March for Science is about is the worry of that. So what that means is that there needs to be, for I think, a healthy scientific culture and also a healthy funding culture for science, is a basic public trust in the institutions of science itself. So what happens if the public at large starts to become skeptical about various scientific claims? That's the dilemma, and I think that's what's at stake in deciding this question. And the problem is that consensus can mean a couple of different things. I mean, if you look up the word in Merriam-Webster, here's what it says. It says, consensus means both general agreement and group solidarity in sentiment and belief. Right? And that's the problem right there, right? So what we want to know is, okay, if there's a consensus about hydrogen being lighter than helium, is it based on groupthink? Is it based on just sort of a common judgment, or is it based on a community actually looking objectively at the evidence and then coming to a rational conclusion? You don't know. There can be a consensus in both cases. We know from the history of science, for instance, especially in the Soviet Union, that consensus is often actually politically enforced. But consensus can also be enforced in much more subtle, but I think equally powerful ways. Social pressure, denial or threats of tenure and funding, simply cocktail party discomfort. These things, I think, in some ways can enforce what is essentially a sociological function of consensus, in some ways much more powerfully, at least as powerfully as the gulags could in a different time and place. And so really what we want to know, on the one hand, is this proposed consensus, is it actually based on an objective evaluation by the relevant experts of the evidence, or is it some kind of groupthink that is being fobbed off on us? There's a sort of great quote from Andrew Coyne in a piece about this. He says, what we want to do is be able to distinguish, as he puts it, between genuine authority and mere received wisdom. How do we tell crankish imperviousness to science or from evidence from legitimate skepticism? Because, of course, that's always the other side. There's always this crank somewhere available immediately online that doubts any particular scientific idea. And so the fact that they're skeptics is not itself an argument against the proposed consensus. And so what is the non-scientist to do? What I would argue is that the best way for a non-specialist to approach this question is by evaluating carefully the sociological context in which the proposed consensus was formed. How was it formed? You may not know anything about fluid dynamics. You may not know anything about dendrochronology or solar physics or any of the relevant scientific subdisciplines that you'd need to know to be able to have a scientific evaluation of the evidence, say, for climate change. But you can evaluate the sociological features that gave rise to the supposed consensus in itself. And so what I did is I've come up with a list. It's a growing list of 12 ways or 12 reasons you might want to doubt a so-called scientific consensus. I won't give all of those to you here today, but for those of you who are here in the auditorium, Heritage Foundation has printed the whole list out so you can grab a copy on your way out, or shameless promotion, you can actually see this essay at stream.org. So let me just give you a few of these sort of examples. Okay, so these are essentially a checklist, not just for climate science, but any proposed consensus, whether it's a political consensus or scientific consensus. And my argument would be that the more of these things that build up, the more justified you are in being skeptical of the claimed consensus, even if you don't know anything about the scientific details. The first is when different claims get bundled together. This is, I think, a sort of key feature of the climate science debate. Anyone that, on any particular day, in fact, my entry under my name at Wikipedia claims that I'm a climate skeptic. Well, no one's a climate skeptic. And in fact, I'm not even skeptical about the human role in climate change or global warming. But what happens is that if you raise questions about any of the kind of bundle of ideas, logically independent ideas that travel under climate science, you get called a denier or skeptic. So at the very least, you could say, with respect to climate change, there's the first sort of empirical question: are we in a warming trend globally on average? It's presumably an empirical and a historical question. What's the cause of that? Or what are the causes of that? And sub-question in there would be, what is the role of human activity? That's a different question. It'd be based on entirely different evidence. So an empirical question of what's happening, it just simply isn't the same question as why is it happening? And you might be really certain about the first question and a little iffy about the second question. And there's the third question, is it bad? It's the evaluative and political question, right? Are we in a warming trend? Is it likely on balance that that's going to be a bad thing for the human race and for life, or a good thing? That doesn't tend to get asked, but in fact, that's a relevant question. And then finally, there's the policy question. Let's say you think we're in a warming trend, it's going to lead to sort of catastrophic climate change. Human activities, in particular greenhouse gas emissions, are the primary cause of that, and it's going to be catastrophic to human life. That tells you nothing about the best set of policies to actually solve the problem and to have the greatest benefits and the least cost. Those are all entirely separate questions. There is no human alive that's an expert in all those questions. In fact, most climate scientists, people like Michael Mann, a dendrochronologist, you might be the world's greatest expert in tree rings and know absolutely nothing about solar physics. And so the very nature of this particular debate means that no one actually has all the relevant information. And so my first of the list of when to doubt a scientific consensus would be when logically separate issues are almost always bundled up together. And you're essentially asked, sign on or sign off. If you doubt any part of the package, you're a denier. That would be one reason why you might want to be a bit skeptical. That's only one issue. I'm not saying any single one of these is dispositive. What I'm saying is that the more of these things that pile up, the more rational a non-scientist or non-specialist is in thinking something skeptical rather than simply assenting to the idea. Let me give you just several others that are sort of related. When scientists are pressured to toe the party line, I first started writing about this particular issue in 2009, right before the Copenhagen UN Climate Conference and the so-called ClimateGate scandal, which was the release of many thousands of emails and documents by leading climate scientists, in which it became clear what those of us that follow the climate blogosphere had known for years, which is that the peer review process, the process of getting grants, are highly cliquish and highly controlled. In fact, scientists that are willing to stick their necks out and raise any particular skeptical question. It's sort of the best possible way to get yourself denied tenure or to get your science funding pulled. I mean, if you're a young scientist, in fact, young scientists that are interested in these issues are almost always advised, look, if you've got skeptical thoughts, don't say anything about it. This is another of the issues on which I think can lead to some skepticism. Are the scientists who raise skeptical questions young scientists without tenure? Or are they old and accomplished scientists at the end of their careers or after they've retired? Who have nothing to lose and actually just more interested than the truth, and they're probably living off a pension. On almost any issue in which you find that sociological dynamic, I would argue you have reason to think some kind of social pressure is at play in the scientific community. In other words, the consensus might be more based on social pressure and cliquishness than on an objective and independent evaluation of the scientific evidence. You see this in the sort of details of the peer-reviewed process, especially in 2009 with the so-called ClimateGate scandal. And you sort of Google this and you get spades of information on it. Let me give you just a couple of more and then we'll stop. When consensus is declared before it actually exists, try to remember a time in which the question of climate change was not declared a consensus. In 2009, Al Gore, of course, had declared that there was no debate actually around. But in 1999, he claimed there was no debate, that there was a consensus. What's interesting is that in his 2009 statement on this, he claimed that as late as 2002, there was still an actual debate, but there was no longer any debate. And in fact, several years before 2002, he himself was saying the debate was already settled. And in fact, this issue almost always is accompanied almost instantaneously by claims of consensus. It was the same thing in the 1970s with global cooling. In 1977, 1976. Media reports said virtually all scientists agree on that. When you hear that kind of language, science says, or scientists agree, well, first of all, science doesn't say anything. It's an institution. But when you hear scientists say, you ought to think, okay, which ones? Is that all of them? These are the kinds of signs that I would argue you want to look for to see, okay, is this based on an objective evaluation of the evidence, or is this actually some kind of clique or social dynamic? Last couple. When the scientific issue is used to justify profound economic and policy changes. Now, I'm not saying if something has policy implications, you ought to doubt it. What I'm saying is that when all of these issues pile up and then you discover that the decision or your particular view on this issue will hinge all sorts of very important economic questions, say changing the global economy, then you want really, really solid evidence. So that's how the late Carl Sagan said. He said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Claims that if you took them seriously would require reorienting the economy of the world ought to have extraordinary evidence. Is a perfectly reasonable request. And if when skeptical questions are raised, people are shouted down, instead of the evidence and the arguments being made, I would argue that's a very good sign that you ought to doubt it. And then one final instance in which I would argue that you ought to doubt the claims of a scientific consensus is when you keep hearing about a scientific consensus. That itself should be a sign of skepticism. Have you ever heard of this consensus that hydrogen is lighter than helium? Or the consensus that the Earth rotates around the sun, right? Or that bacteria sometimes cause human sickness? No, you don't, right? You never hear that. Why? You don't need to. There's absolutely no rhetorical force to it because everybody the evidence can be tested easily. All sorts of things from chemistry can be tested independently by anyone with a lab where the experiment can be run. Climate science, by its very nature, simply doesn't submit to that level of certainty. And so you should expect, if anything, modesty on the part of not only the scientific community, but the public intellectuals and advocates who advocate for these particular views. You should expect modesty. But if instead the experts try to silence you with an invocation of consensus, I would argue that gives you reason to doubt it. Thank you very much, and we have some minutes for conversation. Because it's being taped, if you ask a brief question, and then I will repeat the question to the mic and then pass it to whoever you want to have answered the question. Oh, and we actually have a mic, so wait for the mic to come.
While the questions were going around, I was just going to say that I've noticed the same thing, that when there is a real consensus, people don't need to appeal to it.
That's right.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation. My question is, it's very clear, and in fact, many of these activists who will be here in Washington this weekend are increasingly unashamed about admitting that it is a political movement, it is a political ideology. This is what we believe. We believe capitalism needs to be destroyed, and so on and so forth. How many of those ideas have been alluded to today. You mentioned how the increasing egalitarianism between man and animal, man and plant, in a almost resurgence of the pagan notion of man's relationship to the earth and so forth. How can we fight that and oppose that? How can scientists and non-scientists alike identify and resist that and oppose that to prevent the very awful consequences that are coming down the pipeline in policy and other areas?
The problem with exactly what you've described is that it is anti-human. And I think we need to begin pointing out that a lot of this advocacy is precisely misanthropic and anti-human. And I've got a couple of examples. David Suzuki, who is a very famous Canadian biologist, been around for years. He's a rock star of science. He's done a lot of television. Back in the 70s, he said that human beings are maggots crawling around the earth, defecating on the planet. Now, you might say, well, in the 70s, he was a young, radical fellow, and he no longer means it, but he was asked 2 or 3 years ago whether he wanted to take that back, and he specifically refused to do so and said he just wished human beings would stop being human. David Attenborough, the very famous, very capable naturalist who has done so many wonderful natural wildlife documentaries, has called human beings the, quote, scourge on the planet. And he has supported groups that are for radical human depopulation. Now, the most radical population control regimen in the world is China. I was in China in November, and you saw family after family with one kid because of the one-child policy. They've now made it for 2 children, but not because it's people should get what they want and be happy. It's because they're trying to now centrally control what the demographics will be in 20 or 30 years. But even with the forced abortions, with the female infanticide and so forth, China has not managed to reduce the level of population in the country, merely slow its growth. So if you're going to have actual radical human depopulation, it's going to take incredible tyranny. Now, Attenborough and others like him won't go there. They'll say, well, birth control will solve it. No, it won't. And then the question becomes, do we really have that kind of a problem? But the way it's presented is specifically anti-human. I would even say that Jane Goodall, now this is almost heresy, has harmed science. Now, certainly her observations of the chimpanzees was magnificent, but what did she do? Did she just report on what she observed? No. She anthropomorphized the chimps. And that changed the entire way science actually approaches these issues. And I would call her, to some degree, a novelist. And an example would be where she would describe an elderly female chimp coming into a clearing, sitting for a few minutes, and then leaving. And in the way she would write it is she would say the old lady came into the clearing and looked for some shade. She looked around with satisfaction to see that, that the other chimps were gathering food. She created a life, an inner life for the chimpanzees that she couldn't possibly know. And when she moved from observing the chimps and reporting on her observations in a dispassionate way into an anthropomorphizing way for an ideological purpose, that moved outside of science and into something else. So I think the thing that we have to be aware of, and people need to understand, is when you start having an environmentalism that is so radical that human beings are the cancer on the planet, that's harmful to environmentalism itself. And a proper environmentalism is too important to permit that. I mean, how many people are going to follow a flag that says humans are cancer? I'm not. So we need to stand up for science properly understood, and then policies that properly balance the human equation with our obligation as human beings. We're the only moral species in the known universe. Our obligation, our duty to treat the earth properly. I mean, we protected Yellowstone very well, and we didn't say that Old Faithful Geyser was a person. So it certainly can be done. And I think the anti-humanism really needs to be brought out because I think most people are not anti-human.
Can I take a stab at it too? Yeah, the anti-humanism is important, and I think this is ultimately a battle of ideas. And that part of the way to reverse this is to unmask the source of these ideas, because once the unmasking occurs, it becomes more and more apparent to more and more people that they're really not subject to the arguments that are being promulgated as the consensus. For example, the radical animal rights movement, the denial of human exceptionalism, is a logical consequence of a deeper view that there is no qualitative difference between humans and animals because both were produced by the same process of undirected, unguided, materialistic evolution. And we think that the materialistic theories of evolution, neo-Darwinism, and some of the newer ones that are coming along are empirically false. And so to base an ethical theory on an empirically false foundation like that is fallacious and no way to run the ethical or the country in terms of ethical judgments and policy statements. So these ideas have connections, and basically what we see going on in kind of diagnosis is the scientific ideologies of the late 19th century. Darwinism, which told us where we came from. Marxism, which told us where we were going and had a vision of a utopian future. Freudianism, which painted a picture of what to do about human guilt, essentially replaced the Judeo-Christian foundation of the West, which answered, and those Judeo-Christian religion answered all those same questions. And now, post-19th century, there's been an intellectual consensus in the elite academy in favor of what we call scientific materialism or scientific naturalism. And what we're seeing in the streets, in public policy advocacy, is that worldview, the implications of that worldview starting to trickle out into policy. But it's coming from a deeper worldview consensus that dominates the Western academy. But that consensus is in turn based on 19th century theories that are no longer empirically valid. There are good reasons to doubt all of those theories. So what we're looking to achieve is a shift in worldview by challenging the scientific foundations, the alleged scientific foundations of that larger worldview, which is giving rise to some of these really extreme political and social ideologies.
And let me just give you real quick, if I may, an example of the harm that this can cause. There's a small fishing village in Alaska called Kings Cove. And Kings Cove is in an isolated area. It's mainly Native Americans. And they have an airport, but it's not one that can fly in all weather. And so when they have a medical emergency in their town, which is about 1,000 people, oftentimes people, not oftentimes, but sometimes people have died because of inclement weather. They've been unable to fly to a hospital for people to be taken care of. Somewhat away, a period of miles away, 20 miles away, there is another village with an all-weather airport. And what Kings Cove wanted to do was cut a gravel road from their village or their town to this other town that had an all-weather airport, and it would be gravel, and they were even willing to, this was in a protected area owned and controlled by the federal government, they were willing to take some of their acreage and give it in exchange for the right to cut through this road. And showing what happens, there was a visit by the Obama administration Secretary of the Interior, Sally Jewell, and she listened to people talk about the difficulty and the fear, of course, they'd have if in the middle of a time where they couldn't fly, somebody had a burst appendix. I mean, what are you going to do for these people? You have to get them to a place where there could be surgery. They have a medical clinic, but they don't have a full hospital. And Jewell rejected the road, saying it would jeopardize waterfowl in the refuge. And this is what the congressman said, quote, that was there. She stood up in the gymnasium and told the kids, "I've listened to your stories. Now I have to listen to the animals." Anti-human. Real harm to living and breathing human beings who could die from this decision to cut a road that would cause no intrinsic damage to the area because they have to listen to the animals. The animals didn't care, and the animals wouldn't have been hurt. But when you get this kind of worldview, you end up discarding people as actually sometimes having less value.
Ideas have consequences.
Yeah.
Maybe,
Go
ahead, Marlo.
If I could just add to this conversation, there are people who are bona fide, self-aware misanthropes, and some of them are claiming to be spokesmen for the science. There is that. But as I was trying to explain, there's a lot of absent-mindedness and confusion. And I would say that most people who are marching are, in addition to marching for what they perceive, however vaguely, as their own self-interest, more government funding, more regulatory clout, or just venting anger at Donald Trump. There are people who actually believe that their cause is the cause of humanity, okay? And that may include people who have a strong misanthropic streak, because people are complicated, A lot of us haven't sorted out all of our feelings. I think one point to make to them, though, is that the policies that they want would be horribly destructive to humanity. And I'll just give the Paris Agreement, which is the big cause célèbre now, this treaty that Obama adopted and enrolled the United States in without going through the constitutional treaty process. Its goal is to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius by the year 2100. Now, if you accept the consensus climatology, or let me just back up for a minute. If you actually look at the trend in global temperatures over the last 37 years, the well-established trend as validated by satellites, weather balloons, and other types of observational systems, it works out by 2100 to about 2 degrees above pre-industrial global temperatures. So you could say that the real climate is actually on track to meet this objective without any help from government coercion, all right? But if you accept their consensus climatology, which is not supported by observation, then you have to dramatically reduce global emissions, all right? It's about a 70% reduction in global emissions that you have to achieve by the year 2050. If you're comparing it to, say, the year 2000, or it's 60% if you're comparing it to the year 2010, all right? And it turns out that the only way that you achieve that emission reduction goal by mid-century, given the fact that emissions in the industrial world are almost not growing at all, that all the emissions growth is expected to occur in developing countries, which already exceed collectively in their emissions all the emissions from the United States, Japan, the European Union, other industrial countries. You have to force the developing countries to cut their current emissions by anywhere from about 35% to almost in half, depending on whether the industrial countries by 2050 become zero-emission societies. So let's say if we magically reduce our emissions to zero by 2050 and all the other industrial countries do too, then the developing countries, the energy-poor countries, the countries where more than 1 billion people today don't even have electricity, and billions more don't have enough electricity to support development, and billions don't have automobiles and aircraft, in order to meet reasonable human needs, all right? If we go to a zero-emission economy, and all the industrial countries do too, then developing countries have to cut their current emissions by 35%, which basically means they have to cut their current inadequate reliance or even non-reliance on fossil fuels by almost that much. And if we, the industrial world, only reduce our emissions 80% by 2050, then the developed countries, the energy-poor countries, have to reduce their emissions by almost half. Not their future projected emissions, their current emissions. So that is obviously that obviously has the potential to be a humanitarian disaster of enormous proportions, a cure worse than the alleged disease. And I think this is a point that really needs to be driven home. This is not an insight original with me, but I credit it to Stephen Yulee of the U.S. Chamber Institute for 21st Century Energy. He was several years at the Department of Energy before he went there, and he really knows how to crunch these numbers. And it's actually the only saving grace in this is that the developing countries will never go along with this. But nonetheless, that is the paradigm that a lot of people are trying to shove down their throats and ours. And it's deeply inhumane and unhumanitarian, misanthropic in its effects if it were ever seriously implemented.
Excellent point. Maybe one more question, and then we'll give everyone a break, but the panelists will all stay here afterwards for discussion.
Hi there. Well, thanks for all of your perspectives. It was already very interesting. And I wanted to ask, in a vibrant intellectual environment, there's never 100% consensus. You always have people challenging an idea and seeing how we can push it. But in a world where you do need to use scientific data to make policy choices, regardless of what they may be, at some point it might be helpful to have sort of enough of an idea of what's going on to be able to make a decision. And so my question is, how much certainty is enough to start moving forward with something and I'm really not specifically referring to climate change here, I really mean any policy that might use scientific data, how much consensus is enough, how much certainty is enough, and how do we move forward on things that we have an idea might be the case, while encouraging an active and vibrant community that allows for conflicting ideas and opinions.
That is a terrific question, and I don't think there's a clear answer to it, honestly, though I do think the reason I focus on this question of consensus and the kind of sociological factors is that I think the reality is that what those do is actually prevent society from coming to some kind of general agreement about how to apply science in public policy context. Because obviously you're right. I mean, a vast majority of scientific questions, not even scientists know the answer to. And so we have to have some kind of social mechanism for saying, okay, look, we want science to be open to the evidence, and we want policy to be open to the solid evidence that science provides. And so that's why I actually, I think an honest and open debate about these things publicly, in which we don't invoke social pressure, in which we don't invoke ad hominems, is the best way forward on those things. Precisely because I think many non-experts, you're right, there's always some crank that doubts any particular scientific claim, but they don't have social power, they don't have political power, precisely because they're cranks and maybe they have a private website. What's dangerous is that there would be a general public skepticism of science in general. That would be a catastrophic situation, and that's something certainly none of the panel want to have happen. And so my argument would be that you want a vibrant argument about all these things. And when that happens, I think the average reasonable person who's a non-expert is going to be much more willing to say, look, I'm not an expert, but I trust the scientists on this, than if they suspect at an intuitive level that there's a lot of social pressure being brought to bear on the question. And so I think there's a reason that the public is skeptical about some things and not other things.
I just quickly add to that the educated non-scientist is actually far more capable of understanding arguments pro and con around a number of scientific topics, with provided there's some application of attention to those arguments. And so I think one of the key things that would help us both culturally and politically as well as scientifically is to encourage a true pluralism in which there's a culture of discourse, of rhetoric. The rhetorical function of science, I think, is being neglected. Scientists need to be allowed to have those arguments back and forth and to have that understood as part of the scientific method. That's how science advances. And as the scientists have those arguments back and forth in a more open setting, then people in politics and law who are also comfortable with evaluating arguments can evaluate the arguments of the scientists back and forth. One of the just in the climate change debate, there are a huge number of very prominent skeptics of anthropogenic global warming. Their voices have been muffled, but when you have people like Richard Lindsay at MIT, or Will Happer at Princeton, or Freeman Dyson at Princeton, or John Christie, who was mentioned before, these are high-powered scientists. They're making very compelling arguments, and their voices need to be heard, and the political people need to hear the arguments on both sides before they render judgment. And at the end of the day, there is a judgment involved, but you can't make appropriate judgments unless all sides of the argument have been openly aired out. And I think reinvigorating and encouraging a culture of discourse in science and in politics will help us make better judgments on those tricky questions.
And we already have some of those mechanisms in place, the regulatory mechanisms for approving drugs, for example, the NIH approval process in terms of funding for research and so forth. So those mechanisms already exist. What harms those mechanisms, I think, is precisely what Steve was talking about. When I would have much more faith, for example, in some of what the global warming alarmists say if they weren't trying to stifle so hard people with whom they disagreed, if they weren't trying to prevent people with whom they disagreed from getting tenure, if they weren't trying to prevent people with whom they disagree from getting funding. I think the government should fund both sides of that debate, frankly. And that would then have that kind of open discourse.
That's a really good suggestion, because big scientists can make a big error. If all the funding goes to one paradigm, then it's impossible to test the strength of the opposite one.
Exactly.
And we should have a lot more comparative hypothesis testing and funding of both sides of competing scientific discussions or debates.
And when you have...
May I jump in
Yeah,
here? Yeah. I mean, first of all, Jay, I want to say you probably had this in your long list, but another tip-off that something is amiss here is when one group not only invokes consensus and tries to shame people and stifle debate through stigmatization, but when they call for prosecutions of heretical views, which is what has been done by Senator Whitehouse and Representative Liu and a group of academics that we like to call the RICO 20 for the RICO Act, and of course the attorneys general for clean power led by Mr. Schneiderman of New York. I mean, this is an attempt now to silence and chill speech through the threat of litigation and prosecution. So that's a big thing. But one thing, I mean, I appreciate this idea of the government funding Team B or red teams who would look at alternative hypotheses. But and maybe that's the best that can be done. But ultimately, the ideal, as far as I'm concerned, would be to separate science from state as much as possible. I mean, why is it that we don't have these sorts of controversies in the religious realm? It's because religion is privately funded in the United States. Eisenhower, in his farewell speech, warned of this very problem that we're seeing. A lot of people just remember this as his warning about a military-industrial complex. But he also warned about the, quote, steadily increasing share of scientific research that is funded by or at the direction of the federal government. And he said that whereas historically the fountainhead of free ideas and scientific discovery was the free university, there has been a revolution in the conduct of research, partly because of the huge costs involved. And it means that a government contract has become a virtual substitute for intellectual curiosity. That was already in 1960. And he warned the prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and gravely to be regarded. So he said that in addition to worrying about a military-industrial complex, which most of us don't really worry about that much anymore, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific technological elite, precisely because in the universities, the funding for the university now depends on getting government grants, all right? And those grants are given by agencies which are funded by congressmen who have agendas. I mean, and no government agency, once it gets on this gravy train, and no group of scientists who get on the gravy train want the science to find out that the problem they're working on isn't really as serious and alarming as they said it was, because then the gravy train would stop. And then that's why if you're a university professor and you have doubts or skepticism, you better shut up because you might jeopardize our grant. And then it becomes self-perpetuating because the only people that you hire to work in your department are people who will toe the party line because your funding depends on it. Now, I'm not saying that scientists are falsifying reports because they are dependent on government grants. That's not my point here. My point here is that government basically corrupts everything that it embraces, which is why we have separated religion from government. And to the extent that it's possible, scientific research should similarly be separated from government. Then you would not find climate science in particular being a faction-ridden, orthodoxy-enforcing, political movement, but rather the quest for knowledge.
I disagree with that. I don't think you can take, and you ever will take, government funding out of science. There's a lot of very basic exploratory science that is done that would not be done if it required for-profit companies, for example, to do the research, because they're looking to get a return. Some science research should not be dependent on obtaining a return. Secondly,
yeah, but all of climate science, virtually, with very little exception, is all about impacts, and it's, so much of it is not really useful, except for political purposes.
Climate science is just a small portion of what we're talking about. When you say to take government you would never have this kind of discussion in a more liberal context. Conservatives tend to debate each other freely.
Yeah, this is, and this is, this is a broadly, Wesley, this is a sort of a broad disagreement on the right between the role to which the government ought to have science funding. And I do think it gets us away from the sort
I
of
agree with
core
that.
point. So thanks the Heritage Foundation for hosting this, and thank you all for coming.
I like Ike.